Sarah Miller never imagined that a simple text message would shatter her world and force her to make a choice between safety and loyalty. When her phone buzzed at 3:47 a.m. with coordinates and a desperate voice note from her best friend Emma, she knew something was terribly wrong. Emma's voice was barely a whisper, filled with terror. "They have me, Sarah. I'm somewhere in the mountains near the border. Don't call the police. They're watching. If you're really my friend, you'll come alone." What Sarah didn't know was that Emma had stumbled upon something she wasn't supposed to see during her photography expedition, something that powerful people would kill to keep secret. Now Emma was trapped in the hands of ruthless criminals, who saw her as both a witness and a bargaining chip. With no military training, no weapons, and no backup plan, Sarah faced an impossible decision: abandon her lifelong friend to an uncertain fate, or venture into hostile territory where every shadow could hide an enemy and every step could be her last. The authorities had failed Emma before. The system had let her down when she needed it most. Now, with time running out and Emma's captors growing more desperate, Sarah realized she was her friend's only hope. Armed with nothing but determination, a basic first aid kit, and an old hunting knife that belonged to her grandfather, she prepared to enter a world where mercy was a luxury and survival was never guaranteed. This is the story of what happens when an ordinary person refuses to accept that someone they love is lost forever. It's about the lengths we go to for friendship, the courage we find when everything seems hopeless, and the price we're willing to pay when love demands everything we have to give. Sarah Miller had always been the type of person who planned everything down to the smallest detail. Her apartment was organized, her work schedule color-coded, and her emergency kit fully stocked. She believed in being prepared for anything life might throw at her, but nothing could have prepared her for the message that arrived on her phone at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in September. The buzzing of her phone pulled her from a deep sleep. In the darkness of her bedroom, the screen's glow seemed unnaturally bright. Sarah squinted at the notification, expecting to see a wrong number or perhaps a late-night emergency from work. Instead, she saw Emma's name, and her heart immediately began racing. Emma Peterson had been her best friend since college, but Emma wasn't the type to call in the middle of the night unless something was seriously wrong. The message wasn't a text, it was a voice note, accompanied by a set of GPS coordinates that meant nothing to Sarah at first glance. She pressed play, and Emma's voice filled the quiet room. But it wasn't the confident, cheerful voice Sarah knew so well. This voice was barely above a whisper, shaking with terror and exhaustion. "Sarah, if you're hearing this, then my phone still has signal, which means there's hope." Emma's words came in rushed bursts, as if she was afraid of being overheard. "I'm in trouble. Real trouble. I was doing that photography project in the mountains. You know, the one I told you about last week? I found something I wasn't supposed to find. There are people here, bad people, and they've taken me somewhere. I don't know exactly where, but I managed to get these coordinates before they took my equipment." Sarah sat up in bed, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Emma was a nature photographer, always venturing into remote locations to capture the perfect shot. She was experienced, careful, and knew how to handle herself in the wilderness. The idea that someone had taken her seemed impossible. The voice note continued, and Emma's fear became more apparent with each word. "They're not just random criminals, Sarah. These people are organized, professional. They have weapons, vehicles, communication equipment. They caught me photographing what I think was some kind of drug operation or smuggling route. I saw trucks, unmarked buildings, men with military-style gear. When they realized I'd been taking pictures, everything changed." Sarah's hands were trembling as she listened. She wanted to call the police immediately, but Emma's next words stopped her cold. "Listen to me carefully, Sarah. Don't call the police. Don't call anyone. These people have connections everywhere. They knew things about me, personal things, that they shouldn't have known unless someone gave them information. They mentioned specific details about my family, my work, even you. They're watching, Sarah. They have eyes and ears in places we don't expect." The recording was filled with a moment of silence, and Sarah could hear Emma breathing heavily, as if she was trying to stay calm. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I managed to hide my backup phone when they weren't looking. It's an old one, not connected to my main account, so they don't know about it. But the battery's dying, and I don't know how much time I have. Sarah, I'm scared. Really scared. These men, they're not just holding me for money. They're planning something, and they see me as a problem that needs to be solved permanently." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to her friend's desperate plea. Emma had always been the brave one, the one who took risks and lived life on her own terms. Hearing her reduced to this state of terror was almost unbearable. I know what I'm about to ask is insane, and I know it's not fair, Emma continued. But you're the only person I trust completely. You're the only one I know who would do anything to help a friend, no matter how dangerous. If you're really my friend, if our friendship means anything to you, I need you to come for me. Alone. I know it sounds impossible, but you're my only hope. The coordinates Emma had sent pointed to a location roughly 200 miles north, in a mountainous region known for its remote wilderness and sparse population. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear without a trace. I don't have much time left on this phone, Emma's voice was growing weaker. I'm going to try to leave clues, signs that only you would recognize. Remember our old hiking trips? Remember the code we used to use when we got separated on the trails? I'll use that system if I can. Sarah, please. I don't want to die out here. I don't want to disappear and have my family never know what happened to me. The voice note ended abruptly, and Sarah stared at her phone screen in shock. For several minutes, she couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. The magnitude of what Emma was asking hit her like a physical blow. She was being asked to mount a solo rescue mission into hostile territory, against professional criminals who had already proven they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. Sarah had no military training, no experience with weapons or combat, and no knowledge of the terrain where Emma was being held. She was a marketing coordinator for a small technology company, someone who spent her days in meetings and her evenings reading books or watching movies. The most dangerous thing she had ever done was whitewater rafting on a company retreat. But as she sat in her dark bedroom staring at the coordinates on her phone, Sarah realized that none of that mattered. Emma wasn't just asking for help from a trained professional or an experienced outdoorswoman. She was asking for help from a friend, someone who loved her enough to take an impossible risk. Sarah thought about their friendship, about all the years they had shared. Emma had been there for her through every major crisis in her life. When Sarah's father died unexpectedly, Emma had driven 8 hours in the middle of the night to be with her. When Sarah's engagement fell apart, Emma had helped her pack up her life and start over in a new city. When Sarah struggled with depression after losing her job, Emma had called her every day for months, never giving up, never letting her feel alone. Now Emma was trapped, terrified, and facing the very real possibility of death. And she had reached out to Sarah, not because Sarah was the most qualified person to help, but because she was the person Emma trusted most in the world. Sarah got out of bed and walked to her window, looking out at the city lights in the distance. She thought about calling the police despite Emma's warning, but she knew her friend well enough to trust her judgment. If Emma said the authorities couldn't be trusted, then there was a good reason for that belief. She thought about calling other friends, about assembling some kind of team to help with the rescue. But Emma had been specific about coming alone, and Sarah understood why. The more people involved, the greater the chance of word getting out, of someone making a mistake that could cost Emma her life. Sarah made her decision in that moment, standing at her window in the pre-dawn darkness. She was going to save her friend, no matter what it took. She had no idea how she was going to do it, no plan beyond getting to those coordinates and figuring things out from there. But she was going to try, because that's what friends do for each other. That's what love looks like when everything is on the line. She spent the next several hours preparing. She called in sick to work, telling her boss she had come down with severe food poisoning and wouldn't be in for the rest of the week. She emptied her savings account, withdrawing enough cash to cover expenses without leaving a digital trail. She packed supplies: a first aid kit, energy bars, water bottles, a flashlight, extra batteries, and a hunting knife that had belonged to her grandfather. Sarah also did something she had never done before in her life. She sat down and wrote letters to her family, explaining what had happened and why she had made the choice she was making. She sealed the letters in envelopes and left them on her kitchen table along with instructions for her landlord and her employer. If she didn't come back, at least someone would know what had happened to her. As the sun rose over the city, Sarah loaded her supplies into her car and began the drive north toward the mountains. She had no idea what she would find when she reached those coordinates. No plan for how to locate and rescue Emma, and no backup if things went wrong. But she was going anyway, because some things are more important than safety, more important than common sense, more important than fear. She was going to save her friend, or die trying. The drive to the mountains took Sarah through increasingly remote terrain as she left the familiar highways and entered a world of winding roads and endless forests. Every mile that passed made her feel more isolated, more aware of how far she was traveling from any possible help. Her phone signal grew weaker with each passing hour, and she found herself checking the GPS coordinates obsessively, afraid that she might lose them if her phone died. By noon, Sarah had reached the general area indicated by Emma's coordinates, but the specific location was still several miles into the wilderness, accessible only by hiking trails and old logging roads. She parked a car at a trailhead that seemed to offer the most direct route and tried to appear like any other day hiker enjoying the mountain scenery. Inside, her heart was pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The trail was rougher than anything Sarah had hiked in years. Emma had always been the outdoorsy one in their friendship, dragging Sarah on camping trips and nature walks that she had tolerated more than enjoyed. Now she wished she had paid more attention to Emma's lessons about reading terrain, navigating by landmarks, and moving quietly through the forest. As Sarah climbed higher into the mountains, she began to understand why Emma's captors had chosen this location. The area was incredibly remote, with no cell phone towers, no park rangers, and no regular traffic on the trails. Someone could disappear here completely, and their body might never be found. The thought made her shiver, but she pushed forward, focusing on the GPS coordinates that were leading her deeper into the wilderness. After 3 hours of hiking, Sarah reached a ridge that gave her a view of the valley below. Through her binoculars, she could see what looked like a small compound nestled among the trees. There were several buildings that appeared to be made of wood and metal, painted in colors that blended with the forest. Vehicles were parked nearby, including trucks with covered beds and what looked like military-style equipment. This had to be the place Emma had discovered, the operation she had accidentally photographed. Sarah studied the compound through her binoculars, trying to count the number of people and identify any security measures she could see. At least 6 men moving around the buildings, all of them carrying weapons. Their movements were coordinated and professional, confirming Emma's assessment that these weren't ordinary criminals. Sarah realized she needed to get closer to have any hope of finding Emma, but approaching the compound during daylight would be suicide. She decided to find a safe place to wait until darkness fell, using the time to observe the operation and look for any signs of her friend. She found a cluster of large rocks about half a mile from the compound that provided good cover and a clear view of the target area. As she settled in to wait, Sarah began to notice details that made her stomach turn. The men below were not just armed, they were organized like a military unit. They had established guard posts, patrol routes, and communication protocols. This wasn't a temporary operation or a small-time criminal enterprise. This was something much bigger and more dangerous than Emma had realized when she stumbled upon it. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah watched trucks arrive and depart from the compound. The vehicles were covered, making it impossible to see what they were carrying. But the careful way they were loaded and unloaded suggested valuable or dangerous cargo. Whatever these people were smuggling, it was worth enough to justify this level of security and isolation. Around 4 o'clock, Sarah saw something that made her heart race. A figure appeared at the door of one of the smaller buildings, and even from a distance she could tell it was a woman. The figure was too far away to identify clearly, but something about the way she moved, the way she held herself, was familiar. Sarah was almost certain she was looking at Emma. The woman was escorted by 2 armed guards as she was moved from one building to another. Her hands appeared to be bound behind her back, and she stumbled slightly as she walked, suggesting she might be injured or weakened by her captivity. The sight filled Sarah with a mixture of relief and rage. Emma was alive, but she was clearly being held against her will and might be suffering. Sarah forced herself to remain calm and continue observing. Getting emotional now would only lead to mistakes that could cost both their lives. She needed to gather as much information as possible before attempting any kind of rescue. She noted the location where Emma was being held, the guard rotations, and the general layout of the compound. As evening approached, Sarah noticed increased activity around the compound. More vehicles arrived, and the men began moving equipment and supplies with greater urgency. Whatever operation they were running, something significant was happening tonight. This could be an opportunity, or it could make rescue impossible, depending on how things developed. When darkness finally fell, Sarah began her approach to the compound. She had never been trained in stealth or infiltration, but she drew on every movie and book she had ever consumed about such situations. She moved slowly, testing each step before putting her full weight down, staying in the shadows, and pausing frequently to listen for any sounds that might indicate she had been detected. The forest at night was alive with sounds that seemed amplified in the darkness. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig, every call of a night bird made Sarah freeze in fear that she had been discovered. But she pressed on, driven by the image of Emma bound and frightened in one of those buildings. As Sarah got closer to the compound, she began to pick up fragments of conversation from the guards. Most of it was routine communication, but she heard enough to understand that something big was planned for the following day. There was talk of a shipment, a deadline, and the need to clean up loose ends before moving to a new location. She was almost certain it referred to Emma. These people were planning to eliminate the witness to their operation, probably as soon as their current business was completed. Sarah realized she might have less than 24 hours to save her friend's life. She circled the compound carefully, looking for weaknesses in their security. The guards were professional, but they were focused primarily on watching the access roads and the main approaches to the buildings. They weren't expecting someone to approach on foot through the forest, especially not a lone civilian with no military training. Sarah identified what she thought might be a blind spot in their surveillance, an area behind the smallest building where shadows from the trees created a patch of darkness that the guards couldn't see clearly. If she could reach that spot, she might be able to get close enough to determine which building was holding Emma and possibly find a way inside. The approach would require crossing about 50 yards of open ground, where she would be completely exposed. If anyone happened to look in her direction during those crucial minutes, she would be caught with no chance of escape. But Sarah couldn't see any other option. Every minute that passed brought Emma closer to whatever final solution her captors were planning. Sarah checked her watch. It was just after midnight, and the compound seemed to have settled into its nighttime routine. She could see guards posted at specific locations, but their attention seemed focused outward, watching for approaching vehicles or organized threats, not for a single person trying to sneak in through the back. She took a deep breath, said a silent prayer for courage and luck, and began her sprint across the open ground. Every step seemed to echo like thunder in her ears. Every breath seemed loud enough to wake the dead. But she reached the shadow behind the building without any shouts of alarm or sounds of pursuit. Sarah pressed herself against the wall of the building and tried to calm her racing heart. She had made it this far, but the hardest part was still ahead. She needed to find Emma, determine how to free her, and then somehow escape from a compound full of armed criminals who would kill them both without hesitation if they were discovered. As she crouched in the darkness, Sarah heard something that made her freeze. From inside the building she was leaning against came the sound of someone crying softly. It was a woman's voice, and it sounded like Emma. Sarah had found her friend, but now she had to figure out how to save her without getting them both killed in the process. The building appeared to be some kind of storage facility or temporary shelter, with small windows set high in the walls and a single door that was undoubtedly locked and probably guarded. Sarah began to circle the building slowly, looking for any way inside that wouldn't require going through the main entrance. On the far side of the building, she found what she was looking for. There was a small window that appeared to be slightly open, probably for ventilation. It was about 8 feet off the ground, but there was a stack of wooden crates nearby that might serve as a makeshift ladder. Sarah climbed carefully onto the crates and peered through the window. In the dim light filtering in from outside, she could see the interior of the building. It was a single room with basic furnishings and what looked like camping equipment. In the far corner, she could make out a figure sitting on a cot, hunched over in a position that suggested defeat and despair. It was Emma. Sarah was sure of it now. Her friend was alive, but she looked terrible. Even in the poor light, Sarah could see that Emma's clothes were torn and dirty. Her hair was tangled, and she appeared to be injured. Her hands were bound behind her back, and there was what looked like a chain connecting her ankle to a metal ring set into the floor. Sarah tapped gently on the window frame, trying to get Emma's attention without making enough noise to alert any guards who might be nearby. Emma looked up slowly, and when she saw Sarah's face in the window, her expression changed from despair to disbelief to desperate hope. Emma struggled to her feet and moved as close to the window as the chain would allow. Sarah could see tears streaming down her friend's face as she mouthed words that Sarah couldn't quite make out, but the message was clear. Emma couldn't believe Sarah had actually come for her, and she was both grateful and terrified about what this rescue attempt might cost them both. Sarah gestured for Emma to stay quiet and began examining the window more closely. It was an old-style window with a simple latch mechanism that looked like it might be possible to manipulate from outside. If she could get the window open, it might be wide enough for Emma to squeeze through, assuming they could figure out how to deal with the chain around her ankle. As Sarah worked on the window latch, she realized that this was the moment when everything would change. Either she would successfully free Emma and they would escape together, or they would both be caught and killed by the criminals who had turned this remote mountain location into their base of operations. There was no middle ground, no partial success. It was all or nothing, life or death, and the outcome would be determined in the next few hours. Sarah had come too far to turn back now. She had ventured into enemy territory, crossed dangerous ground, and found her friend alive. Now she had to finish what she had started, no matter what the cost might be. Sarah worked frantically but quietly on the window latch, her fingers numb from cold and shaking from adrenaline. The metal mechanism was old and corroded, resistant to her efforts to manipulate it from outside. Every few seconds, she paused to listen for approaching footsteps or voices that might indicate a guard was coming to check on Emma. The silence around the building was both reassuring and terrifying, suggesting either that her approach had gone unnoticed or that she was walking into a trap. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the latch finally gave way with a soft click that seemed to echo through the night air. Sarah froze, waiting to see if the sound had attracted attention. When no alarm sounded and no shouts erupted, she carefully pushed the window open just wide enough to communicate with Emma without making the opening too obvious from a distance. Emma moved as close as her restraints would allow, and for the first time since receiving that desperate voice message, Sarah could see her friend clearly. Emma's face was bruised, her lip was split, and there was a deep cut above her left eyebrow that had been bleeding. Her clothes were torn and filthy, and she looked like she'd lost weight during her captivity. But her eyes were alert and focused, showing that her spirit hadn't been broken despite her ordeal. "Sarah," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and fear. "I can't believe you actually came." "This is insane. These people are killers. They've been talking about what they're going to do to me once their business here is finished." Sarah reached through the window and managed to touch Emma's face gently. "I'm getting you out of here," she whispered back. "But we need to figure out how to deal with that chain around your ankle." Emma looked down at the restraint that connected her to the floor. "It's locked with a padlock, and I don't know where they keep the key. One of the guards has it, but I don't know which one." "Sarah, even if you could get me free, how are we supposed to get out of here? There are men with guns everywhere, and they know this area better than we do." Sarah had been wondering the same thing, but hearing the doubt in Emma's voice strengthened her resolve. "We're going to figure it out as we go. I've been watching them for hours, and I think I understand their patrol patterns. Most importantly, they're not expecting anyone to try a rescue, especially not someone like me." Emma managed a weak smile despite her situation. "Someone like you?" "Sarah, you're the bravest person I know. You might not realize it, but you've always been the one who stands up when things get difficult. Remember when we were in college and you confronted those guys who were harassing that freshman girl? Remember when you quit that job where your boss was embezzling money even though you needed the income? You've always done the right thing when it mattered." Sarah felt tears in her eyes, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate problem. "We need to get that chain off your ankle. Do you have any idea what tools they might have around here that could cut through it?" "There's a work area behind the main building where I saw them maintaining their vehicles and equipment. I remember seeing what looked like bolt cutters and other heavy tools. But Sarah, that area is right in the middle of their compound. There's no way to get there without being seen." Sarah considered their options. She could try to overpower a guard and take his key, but she had no training in combat, and the men here were clearly professionals. She could try to pick the lock, but she had no experience with that either. Or she could attempt to retrieve bolt cutters from the work area, which would require crossing the most heavily guarded part of the compound. "What about creating a distraction?" Sarah suggested. "If I could draw their attention to one side of the compound, maybe I could slip into the work area while they're investigating." Emma shook her head. "These aren't amateurs, Sarah. If you create a distraction, they'll send one or two people to investigate while the others maintain their positions and increase security. You'll just make things harder for yourself." As they whispered back and forth, Sarah became aware of increased activity around the compound. She could hear vehicle engines starting and men calling out instructions to each other. Something was happening, and it might be the opportunity they needed. "Stay here and stay quiet," Sarah told Emma. "I'm going to see what's going on. Maybe whatever they're doing will give us a chance." Sarah climbed down from the window and made her way carefully around the building to get a better view of the compound's central area. What she saw made her heart sink. The criminals were preparing to move out, loading equipment and supplies into trucks with military efficiency. This wasn't just increased activity, it was the beginning of an evacuation. She realized that Emma's time was running out faster than either of them had expected. If these people were preparing to abandon this location, they would eliminate any evidence of their presence, and Emma was definitely evidence that needed to be eliminated. Sarah returned to the window where Emma was waiting anxiously. "They're getting ready to leave," she whispered urgently. "This might be our only chance. When they're focused on loading their trucks, I'm going to try to get those bolt cutters." "Please don't do this. It's too dangerous. Just go back to your car and call for help. Tell the authorities where I am and let them handle it." Sarah squeezed Emma's hand. "By the time help arrives, you'll be gone. These people aren't going to leave witnesses behind. If I don't act now, I'll never see you alive again. The activity in the compound was intensifying, and Sarah could see that several of the guards had been reassigned to help with the loading operation. The security around the perimeter was lighter than it had been earlier, but the work area where the tools were stored was still in full view of the main buildings. Sarah made her decision. She was going to wait for the moment when the most people were busy with the trucks, then make a run for the tool area, grab the bolt cutters, and get back to Emma before anyone noticed what was happening. She watched the pattern of activity for several minutes, timing the movements of the guards and workers. There was a rhythm to their operation, moments when most people were focused on the same task and not watching the surrounding area as carefully. When the moment came, Sarah moved. She sprinted from her hiding place behind Emma's building toward the work area, staying low and keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The distance that had seemed manageable from a distance felt enormous when she was actually crossing it, exposed and vulnerable to discovery. Sarah reached the work area and immediately began searching for bolt cutters among the scattered tools and equipment. She found them hanging on a pegboard along with various other heavy tools. As she grabbed the bolt cutters, she heard footsteps approaching and voices getting closer. Two men were walking toward the work area, discussing something about loading protocols and departure times. Sarah looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but the area was too open and well lit to offer any real concealment. She was going to be discovered, and once that happened, both she and Emma were dead. In desperation, Sarah crawled under one of the trucks parked near the work area, clutching the bolt cutters against her chest and praying that the shadows beneath the vehicle would hide her from view. The men walked within feet of her hiding place, their boots visible in the gravel as they discussed their timeline for completing the evacuation. "Boss wants everything loaded and ready to move by dawn," one of them said. "That gives us about 3 hours to finish up and clean house." "What about the photographer?" the other man asked. "Are we taking her with us or dealing with her here?" Sarah's blood ran cold as she listened to them discuss Emma's fate, as if they were talking about a piece of equipment that needed to be disposed of. "Boss says we deal with her here," the first man replied. "Too risky to transport her, and we can't let her go. She's seen too much and could identify too many people. Make it quick and clean, then we'll bury her somewhere in the forest where she'll never be found." The men moved on, continuing their conversation about departure logistics, but Sarah remained frozen under the truck, processing what she had just heard. Emma was going to be killed before dawn, which was less than 3 hours away. There was no more time for careful planning or waiting for the perfect opportunity. Sarah had to act now, or her friend was going to die. She waited until the voices faded, then crawled out from under the truck and began making her way back to Emma's building. The bolt cutters were heavier than she had expected, making it more difficult to move quietly, but she managed to reach the building without being detected. When she appeared at the window again, Emma's face lit up with relief. "I thought they had caught you," she whispered. "I heard voices getting closer, and then silence for so long." Sarah showed Emma the bolt cutters. "I heard them talking. They're planning to kill you before they leave, which gives us maybe 2 hours. We're going to cut that chain right now and get out of here." Emma nodded, understanding that stealth was no longer an option. They were committed to this course of action, whatever the consequences might be. Sarah climbed through the window, which was more difficult than she had expected, but manageable with Emma's help pulling her inside. Once in the room, Sarah could see the full extent of Emma's injuries and the conditions she had been enduring. The building was cold, damp, and filled with the smell of mold and decay. Emma had been given minimal food and water, and her physical condition reflected the harsh treatment she had received. But there was no time to address Emma's injuries or comfort her. Sarah positioned the bolt cutters around the chain near Emma's ankle and began applying pressure. The chain was thick and made of hardened steel, designed to resist exactly this kind of attempt to break free. As Sarah worked on the chain, Emma kept watch through the window for any approaching guards. "They're still busy with the trucks," she reported quietly, "but I can see someone checking the buildings periodically. We don't have much time." The bolt cutters were making progress, but slowly. Each squeeze of the handles created a small cut in one of the chain links, but it was going to take multiple attempts to break through completely. Sarah's hands were beginning to ache from the effort, and sweat was dripping down her face despite the cold air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, the chain link gave way with a soft metallic snap. Emma was free from the restraint that had kept her prisoner, but her hands were still bound behind her back with rope that would need to be cut as well. Sarah quickly used a knife from her pack to cut Emma's bonds, and for the first time in days, Emma was able to move freely. She hugged Sarah fiercely. both women crying silently as they realized they had actually succeeded in the first part of their escape. But they were still inside a compound full of armed criminals, miles from the nearest help, with no transportation and no clear plan for getting to safety. The hardest part of their ordeal was still ahead of them. With Emma finally free from her restraints, both women faced the daunting reality of their situation. They were inside a compound controlled by armed criminals, surrounded by wilderness, with no vehicle and limited supplies. Emma was weak from her ordeal and injured, while Sarah was exhausted from the stress and physical demands of the rescue attempt. But they were together, and they were alive, and that gave them hope. Sarah helped Emma to her feet, and immediately noticed that her friend was having trouble putting weight on her left ankle. It wasn't just from the chain that had restrained her, there was an actual injury that was causing her to limp badly. "They kicked me during the first day when I tried to escape," Emma whispered, seeing Sarah's concerned expression. "I think it might be sprained or broken. I can walk, but not very fast or very far." This was a complication Sarah hadn't anticipated. Her mental escape plan had involved moving quickly through the forest, covering as much ground as possible before their absence was discovered. With Emma unable to walk at full speed, they would need to find an alternative approach. Sarah looked out the window and assessed their immediate situation. The evacuation activities were continuing, which meant most of the guards were focused on the loading operation rather than security. This was their best opportunity to escape the compound, but they needed to move while the distraction lasted. "Can you make it to the tree line behind this building?" Sarah asked Emma. "Once we're in the forest, we can move more slowly and carefully."
Emma nodded, though Sarah could see the pain and exhaustion in her face.
"I'll make it. I've survived this long. I'm not giving up now." Sarah gathered her supplies and helped Emma climb through the window. Getting Emma out was more difficult than getting herself in had been, since Emma was weakened and injured, but they managed it without making enough noise to attract attention. Once outside, they faced their first major obstacle. Between their current position and the safety of the forest was approximately 100 yards of open ground that was partially illuminated by lights from the compound. They would be visible for at least part of that distance, and if anyone happened to look in their direction during the crossing, they would be caught with no chance of escape. Sarah studied the pattern of activity around the compound, looking for a moment when the fewest people would be in position to spot them. The loading operation seemed to follow a rhythm, with periods of intense activity followed by brief lulls as people moved between tasks. "When I say go, we move as fast as you can manage," Sarah told Emma. "Don't look back, don't slow down, just focus on reaching those trees." They waited for what seemed like the right moment, then began their desperate sprint across the open ground. Emma's injured ankle made her movements awkward and painful, but she kept pace with Sarah through sheer force of will. They reached the halfway point without any shouts of alarm, then the 3/4 mark, and finally dove into the cover of the forest just as voices erupted from the compound behind them. Someone had discovered that Emma was missing. The voices were angry and urgent, followed by the sound of running feet and slamming doors. Lights began sweeping the area around the compound as the criminals realized they had a serious problem. Sarah and Emma pressed themselves against the ground behind a fallen log, listening as their former captors organized a search. The voices were growing more organized and purposeful, indicating that these men were experienced in tracking and hunting human beings. "They're going to come after us with dogs and tracking equipment," Emma whispered. "These people are professionals. They know how to hunt fugitives in this kind of terrain." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had succeeded in freeing Emma from immediate danger, but now they faced an even greater threat. They were being hunted by people who knew the area, had professional equipment, and had experience tracking down people who tried to escape. "How much of a head start do you think we have?" Sarah asked. Emma listened to the sounds coming from the compound. "Maybe 15 or 20 minutes before they get organized and start following our trail. But Sarah, I need to tell you something. This area is huge, and it's easy to get lost even in daylight. At night, without proper equipment, we could wander in circles for days and never find our way out." Sarah thought about the GPS device in her pack, but she realized it would be useless for navigation once they moved away from the coordinates Emma had provided. She knew the general direction back to where she had parked her car, but in the darkness and rough terrain, maintaining the correct heading would be extremely difficult. "Do you remember anything about the geography from when they brought you here?" Sarah asked. "Any landmarks or distinctive features that might help us navigate?"
Emma closed her eyes and tried to recall details from her capture and transport.
"I was unconscious for part of the trip, but I remember crossing a stream or small river shortly before we reached this place." If we can find that water source, it might lead us downhill and eventually to a road or trail. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than wandering randomly through the wilderness. Sarah helped Emma to her feet, and they began moving deeper into the forest, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the compound before their pursuers began tracking them in earnest. Moving through the forest at night was treacherous under the best of circumstances. With Emma injured and both women exhausted, every step was a struggle. The ground was uneven and covered with fallen branches, loose rocks, and hidden holes that could cause a serious fall. They used Sarah's flashlight sparingly, knowing that the light could be seen from a great distance and would give away their position. After about an hour of difficult travel, they heard the sound of running water nearby. Sarah's heart leaped with hope as she realized they had found the stream Emma remembered. If they followed it downstream, it should lead them away from the compound and toward lower elevations where they were more likely to find roads or other signs of civilization. But as they approached the water, they also heard something else that made their blood run cold. Behind them, in the distance, came the sound of dogs barking. Their pursuers had indeed brought tracking animals, and the dogs were following their scent trail through the forest. "They're gaining on us faster than I expected," Emma said, panic evident in her voice. "Those dogs will follow our trail no matter how far we go or how well we try to hide." Sarah looked at the stream flowing past them in the darkness. The water was cold and fast-moving, but it represented their best hope of throwing off the tracking dogs. "We need to get in the water," she told Emma. "If we follow the stream, it might confuse our scent trail enough to buy us more time." Emma nodded, understanding the necessity, even though she was clearly dreading the prospect of entering the cold mountain water in her weakened condition. They waded into the stream, gasping as the icy water reached their knees and then their waists. The current was stronger than it had appeared from the bank, and the rocky bottom made footing treacherous. Emma struggled to maintain her balance with her injured ankle, and Sarah found herself constantly reaching out to steady her friend as they made their way downstream. The water was shockingly cold, and within minutes both women were shivering uncontrollably. Sarah realized they couldn't stay in the stream for very long without risking hypothermia, but every minute they spent in the water was a minute their scent trail was being washed away. They followed the stream for what Sarah estimated was about half a mile before the cold forced them to get out of the water. They were both soaked and shivering, but the barking of the dogs seemed more distant now, suggesting that their strategy had been at least partially successful. Sarah helped Emma out of the water, and they found a sheltered spot among some large rocks where they could rest and try to warm up. Sarah had packed some emergency blankets in her supplies, and she wrapped them both in the metallic material, trying to conserve what body heat they had left. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," Emma said through chattering teeth. "I'm so sorry I got you into this. You should have stayed home and called for help instead of risking your life for me." Sarah pulled Emma closer, sharing warmth and offering comfort. "Don't you dare apologize. This is what friends do. This is what love looks like. I would rather die out here with you than live with the knowledge that I didn't try to save you when you needed me." They rested for about 20 minutes, until the sound of the dogs became audible again in the distance. Their pursuers were persistent and professional, and the water had only delayed them, not stopped them completely. Sarah and Emma resumed their desperate flight through the darkness, following what they hoped was a path towards safety. Every step was a struggle. Every sound in the forest could be their hunters getting closer, and every minute that passed brought them closer to dawn, when their visibility would improve, but so would the visibility of their pursuers. As they stumbled through the forest, Emma began to lag behind more noticeably. Her injured ankle was getting worse, and the combination of her injuries, exhaustion, and exposure to the cold was taking a serious toll. Sarah realized they couldn't maintain this pace much longer, and if they were caught in open ground during daylight, they would have no chance of escape. "Sarah, I need to rest," Emma said, her voice weak and strained. "I can't keep going like this. Maybe you should go on without me and try to get help." Sarah stopped immediately and turned to face her friend. "I'm not leaving you. We're going to make it out of this together. Or not at all. We just need to find somewhere we can hide during the day and then figure out our next move." As if in answer to Sarah's words, they crested a small hill and saw lights in the valley below. It wasn't the harsh artificial lighting of the criminal compound, but the warm, scattered lights of what appeared to be a small town or village. Civilization was closer than they had dared to hope, and for the first time since beginning their escape, Sarah allowed herself to believe they might actually survive this ordeal. But between them and those lights lay several more miles of difficult terrain, and behind them, the sounds of their hunters were growing closer with each passing hour.